My story began when I was in labor with my daughter in July of 2000. I was induced into labor and had been having contractions for about 13 to 15 hours and hadn't progressed very much, so it came to a point where my daughter's heart rate dropped very low, and it was too dangerous to allow my labor to continue. They needed to do an emergency C-section. So at that point, I just heard that I needed to have a C-section and quickly became okay with it. Then I started palpitations in my chest. I felt my heart racing, and I couldn't catch my breath, and I remember turning to my mother, who was at my side, and I said, "I'm having trouble breathing," and immediately the nurses jumped in. My mother was taken away. I was pulled on my left side, oxygen was put on my face, and they started wheeling me out of the room, and that was in the hallway, and I was trying to breathe. I was trying to bring air into my lungs, and it just became absolutely impossible. It was like sucking air through a teeny tiny little straw. I was just trying to breathe, and there was no desperation or panic. I was so focused on breathing, and now all I was thinking about was my baby. The next thing I remember was just, trying to breathe and feeling this from behind me and above me, this sort of peace come. My eyes closed, and the next moment of my vision returning was I was way above my body. I didn't recognize the object below was me. I didn't know that I had been a human being. I was just this pure conscious awareness, and I watched these tiny black particles come racing up to where my vision was and sort of surrounded my vision in this undulating little static cloud. I was completely detached from everything that was going on. I didn't have any earthly references at all. I didn't know what human was. I didn't know what people were. I didn't know I had been one, and I watched my daughter being born. I saw my doctor with her in his hands and then hand her to somebody at my right shoulder who took her and turned around, and I remember feeling curiosity, wanting to know what's going on here, and then I sort of floated around to the other side of the room. There was another person at my left shoulder sort of doing this motion, and I know later that I had a catheter put inside my chest, and then I had this tugging to my left. It was sort of like a pulling, and I resisted because I wanted to stay there and wanted to know more, and it pulled again a little bit harder, and I just agreed. I said, "Okay, I'll go," and I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know what was pulling me. As soon as I sort of released this resistance to staying, I started moving very quickly through it was like an undulating wall into this bright white flash of space, and then into the denser particles that I was, but very dense, and I sort of merged into that, and I was moving along very, very fast, but it didn't feel fast. And I looked to my side and saw that the dense particles were sometimes a little bit fluid, a little bit like grayish white and black. And all of a sudden, I stopped, and I had this download of information, and it was the answer to all the questions I'd ever had. It wasn't like specific ones that I was thinking in my mind that were being answered. There was no thinking mind for me. It was everything. Everything was through feeling, through emotion, energy. All of my questions were answered, and it all came down to one answer, and that was love. And I just remember feeling this, the moment that I realized that, I felt this immense, all-encompassing, blissful love. I could have just enjoyed that feeling forever. And then, I saw a white sort of speck off to my left in the distance, and it was sort of drawing me to it. And I wanted to go to it, so I started moving in that direction. And as I got closer, it got wider and wider and wider. And it was sort of this roundish, cloud-like opening. And in the opening, there were these shadow beings. And there were adults, and there was a little boy in the front. I knew it was a little boy. Again, everything is through feeling, and I felt that it was a little boy. And I could feel that he needed my help. So, I went into that space. I went past them, and they all sort of fanned out to my left. And I moved into the room, and it was cloudy, grayish white space. It was just very calm, very neutral. Then, the shadow beings were sort of surrounding me, and the little boy was gone. And I remember looking around and wondering where he went. And then, they started to come at me one by one and dart away very quickly. And I realized they were taking my energy. And I started to sort of diminish in that space, almost like how it felt when I passed out in the hallway, where everything just kind of was starting to fade. And I felt, no, I don't want to stay here any longer. And I was pulled out of there. I was back in the dense, dark particulate space that opened up to this beautiful scene where everything was very vibrant, yellow flowers, this huge field. And beyond that, there were green rolling hills and trees dotting in a blue sky. And there was a rocky, moss-covered waterfall. And then, to my right, there was this dense, dark evergreen forest. And I merged into this, and I was immediately one with all of it. It was me, I was it, and it was just incredibly beautiful and peaceful. And I could have stayed there eternally. And then, I was flanked on both sides by these very tall, beige-colored beings that were sort of draped in beige. And they didn't have faces. And they communicated through feeling. If you want to stay here, you can stay here. If you want to go to what is beyond this, you can do that too. Or you can go back. And I didn't know what came afterwards. I didn't have a sense of that. And I didn't know what going back meant. But that's what I chose. And as soon as I felt I'd like to go back, I started moving backwards very quickly. And they sort of turned, and the opening turned, and communicated, if you go back, you need to share what you learned here. And I said, okay. The next thing I knew, I had terrible pain in my chest. What happened after that? I was in the ICU for about 36 hours. I was intubated. They were able to then extubate me and bring me around. They had put me in a medically induced coma to recover from the cardiorespiratory arrest that I had had. I was without a pulse for 8 minutes. And my daughter had been born by emergency C-section during that period of time and had to be transferred to another hospital that had a neonatal intensive care unit because she was having some medical problems. And I came out of that coma, and they transferred me out into my own room. And when I came around, I didn't remember any of that. But, I didn't remember my near-death experience right away. I was just very changed. Before that, I'd been very type A, always just very intense. And after that, I was sort of this kind of lackadaisical, like, what? What are you worried about? There's nothing to worry about. I was just sort of floating, through my days. And I woke up one day, weeks later, at home and woke up in the morning. And it was like I had the full recall of my experience, and it was as if I were there. It was hyperreal. It was so clear. And so, I had experienced it, And I remember just yelling for my husband, and he came running, and he's like, "What's going on?" And I was just in tears. I was so overwhelmed, so deeply, deeply changed from it that I couldn't articulate it. I tried to tell him, and he listened, and he said, "Well, I'm just glad you're here, And I just felt so let down because this was such an amazing experience, and I wanted to share it. And it had transformed me. From that point, I would oscillate back and forth, struggling to share it and to understand it. It took me years to start to really talk about my NDE. I've seen people physically change after I walk in and start speaking to them, and it's very healing. We have the ability to do that for each other.